It's great to see so many people on the line to join us for today's learning event, which is focused on GBV incident data, or using GBV incident data as an indicator of program success. And as usual, we do have a few group norms here at the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa. If you could please make sure that your cameras are off so that everybody has the best bandwidth or likelihood to be able to stream with us. So please, if you could do a kindness and make sure that your videos are turned off, your cameras, we would appreciate it. My name is Jessica Gorham, and I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor based here in Nairobi, covering East and Southern Africa on behalf of the GBV AOR, which is the Global Coordination Mechanism for Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies. We are here based at UNFPA, but along with our role with the GBV AOR, we are also the co-chair of the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa, which is our the forum that is presenting this learning event today. We co-chair the Regional GBV Working Group with IRC, and so we're happy to see so many of our members on the line today to discuss this really important topic related to the use of incident data. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, if you could please write them in the chat, we would appreciate it. So please write all of your questions in the chat, and then I will be monitoring the chat, and I can write those questions down on your behalf and present them to our speaker, Adish, during the Q&A. So please do write any questions you might have in the chat, and then I can present them to our speaker, Adish, during the Q&A. We know that we have many colleagues also joining us from DRC and other countries throughout the region who are primarily speaking French. Please note that we also hope to have a similar learning event that will be facilitated in French as well, and that this learning event is being recorded, so you can find it on our YouTube channel as usual. And I'm going to ask Kabeli if you could put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. So this learning event and all previous ones you can find on YouTube. So please do check our YouTube channel out. I think without further ado, I would like to introduce the chair of our information management pillar of the Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa, and my colleague, Adish. Adish, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I will monitor the chat, and then we can come back during the Q&A. So thanks, Adish, for joining us, and I'm excited to learn more about the use of GBV incident data and how we can use that and other indicators for success. Over to you, Adish.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this learning event. As Jessica said, my name is Adish Madhu, and I am the GBV AOR Information Management Officer, the Regional IMO for East and Southern Africa. So across our sector, across our field of GBV, and so many other sectors, data today has become quite a commodity with a lot of value. And more data in general are being used as decision-making tools. Information, evidence-based decision-making is being made for planning, advocacy, for resource mobilization, for example. So the need for data is extremely important and has increased over the years. Talking about GBV data, quality GBV data is even in more higher demand, if I may say, and especially that we want to use GBV data to inform the response, right? So there are issues related to using GBV data, to collecting GBV data, whether it is incident, whether it is other type of information related to gender-based violence. There are issues of confidentiality. There are issues related to what we can know or what we need to know about the violence itself. So there is also additionally, I would say, a reluctance to share information from service providers, from actors of GBV, because of so much misinterpretation and misuse of that data. So we want to talk a bit about this element, specifically on incident data. And change my, there you go. And but we want to go first, take a step back and see what kind of data we're talking about. So what type of data comes from GBV? Who will need the data? What are the partners, the actors, the donors? What is the community? What the community is needing data? Also, we'll be discussing about the purpose of data. How do we use it? What it is used for informing, for analyzing. What are the risks related to that, to the data itself, and how we can better minimize those risks or mitigate those, and putting that into practice with some example and discussions towards the end of this presentation. So who needs data? Service providers, so providers of GBV services, if I can put it like that, to be precise, and actors of GBV are requested for data. What kind of data and who will be requesting that data? So government can be requesting that. Donors, UN agencies, other GBV partners as well. For internal program monitoring, there will be need for data. Basically, so many different partners or actors in general, everyone may need data, especially if working in the sector of GBV. But what kind of data is required? Are we talking about numbers? We want absolute numbers. Talking about incident data. How many incidents of GBV happen? Are we talking, what are we talking about? Incidents, or are we talking about people? So how many survivors of GBV are we talking about? Are we using that number to understand how big the problem is? But is the number that we're looking at for survivors that have reported cases? So how many cases are reported? And at the end of the day, we want to know, well, how many is actually too many? Because, well, there are different data for different purposes. We want to be able to, again, inform and analyze, to be able to communicate. We want to tell a story. But if we're only using just numbers, just figures, maybe then it's not the right story that is being told. Without a point of reference, without a context, it is difficult to be able to better inform and to better analyze the data as it comes. We want to use it for monitoring. We want to be able to understand how our program has been functioning, how as a service provider we've been able to reach the survivors with the different services that are offered with regards to GBV, right? At the same time, though, when we're looking at incidents, reporting on cases, reporting in a development context is different from an emergency context. So GBV in emergency is even more complex to report on because of volatility, for example. Prevalence may be different as well. It's more difficult in general, just to summarize it. The risks are higher, right? So how do we actually use that data? We have to be very careful. Using just a number sometimes brings risk of de-dramatizing. How high a number is may be different from one context to another. It can be less of a problem in one context compared to another context, right? Depending on how high numbers are, or what looks high in one context may be not that importantly assessed in another, right? So there is a need to be able to understand how that data is behind, so you contextualize it. Behind those data, and this is very important, I think, it's not just data, it's not just percentage or numbers. We have individuals, we have communities, we have staff, we have programs, service providers. Using or misusing the data can put these different people at risks of more GBV or retaliation, depending on the context where you are. So using that in a safe way, in a secure way, with ethics is extremely important. And using that, putting that in practice again, there needs to be an understanding of how you use that data. You create data. Every actor, whether it's a service provider, whether they are in different types of program related to GBV, are creating data. Because as I said, you are reaching people, beneficiaries, survivors. These people who are reached are actually adding to the data and to the information that will help us better monitor and better take the right decision for better programming as well, or intervention and activities. So at an interagency level, when you have service providers in GBV all around a country, within the working group, within a subcluster, GBV subcluster, for example, or AOR, there's a need to know what kind of data can be shared. There needs to be a protocol in place to know how it is distributed, who can access the data, what exactly the numbers that can be shared, what is the granular level that you want to allow people to have access to. Would you give information on the survivor? Would you give information on the perpetrators or alleged perpetrators, and on the region these things happen? So it's really important to have a discussion within a task force, for example, within the service providers, and I agree what kind of information can be shared. And that allows us, again, as I said, for better prioritization, finding gaps, and identify as well. It's important for advocacy when you are able to have ways of sharing data. However, and again, in practice, we see that in certain contexts, right? You have so many contexts. The way the data is captured differs from one agency to the other, from one service provider to the other. The GBV IMS, which is the Gender-Based Violence Information Management System, was created at some point to harmonize data collection. One of the reasons why it was created is to find a way to have common standards and to harmonize definitions as well of what type of GBV we're talking, what are the different types of GBV that should be assessed or captured or taken care of, right? At the same time, what kind of services are provided. So you want to harmonize that with a common registration form, for example, with common definition, with common ways of working, which allows them to use the data in a more interoperable way, in a more comprehensive way around all the different organizations. So having the same language obviously helps in understanding each other, right? So again, just to clarify what we were talking about, right? So we're talking about the data about the incident data, information about incident data. So what would be incident data? And I was talking about service providers. We're talking about reported GBV incidents. What kind of incidents? What are the different types of GBV we're talking about? So these data sharing protocols allows us to understand what we're talking about, if it is the same understanding that we have about those different types of GBV. And we're talking also about case management, right? So this is very particular. And in this regard, I think it's not talking about prevalence. We're talking about cases that are reported. As you know, it's prevalence is something that we don't really like talking about when we're talking about GBV, especially incident data. Although, and I'll come to that in a minute, although service providers are requested to measure the success of their program. So as a service provider, how many people have been reached, how many people have been treated or provided with a service, and what type of service were given. So can this type of data, can it be used to measure the success of the program? Have you been able to understand in terms of numbers? Would that show the number of all the cases in one context? Probably not, obviously not, because as most of you know, as actors in GBV, well, it's we can't assume that the numbers show how many survivors have been affected, because most of it a lot of it at least, remains unreported. So we are going to use data that is comparable to improve and inform our response. We want to show trends in reporting, and so I'll show you examples of what can be done. We want to see the gaps. We want to prioritize also our activities. We want to be able to do coordination. We should be able to better advocate for resource mobilization, for example. So these are some of how incident data can measure success, but can we actually use everything? And should we use everything? What are we talking about when we're talking about incident data? This is primary data. So we are registering personal information about people who are survivors of GBV. And what is the information that is captured there? Do we have a common understanding again of what we're talking about? Are the definitions for the types of GBV the same? In some contexts, for example, if we take the GBV IMS, which is not everywhere, but it has a certain protocol that is in place. But in certain contexts, there are types of GBV that are not included, but at global level, but as it should be contextualized. So you have those type of GBV that should appear in a particular context and not in another one, right? Services that need to be captured when data is collected or created, because these services are very particular in certain contexts and maybe not relevant for others, right? Madagascar, for example, you have early child marriage that is captured within the registration form. In other contexts, sensitization or advocacy campaigns, sensitization or information campaigns is captured for as a service because it is one way of reaching people, although it is not part of the 6 widely recognized definition of services, but it has to be captured one way or the other, right? So these are some of the different ways that it is captured, whether it's on Excel, whether it's using a form, whether it's using a paper form, or the GBV IMS. The tool itself is not the most important, but the most important is have a common understanding and an harmonized and standard way of collecting data. You can't compare apples with oranges. It has to be commonly understood what we're talking about, and it has to be shared, right? As I said, the language is important because the misuse of data is very much present. Because sharing, again, as I said, identification of survivors is probably a no-no. When you're sharing case numbers, we're talking about incident data. So sharing incident data, well, this can lead at the end of the day to identifying survivors, identifying service providers. And even if there are no identifying information, names, for example, but if you're talking about low geographic level, we're talking about a particular admin level, a village or a city, and we're talking about disabled, a person with a survivor with disability in a particular area, in a specific town. Well, if there aren't so many people with disabilities, that person can be actually recognized, right? If you're sharing this kind of information, that could end in a breach in confidentiality. And it may cause survivors to actually lose not only trust in this GBV service, but maybe lose their lives. So it is very important to know what you are able to share. Again, talking about prevalence, when you are talking about contextual information and talking about how the data is collected, well, case numbers are often misinterpreted because the prevalence data is not there's incident data is not prevalence data, just to make it clear. We can't assume that the numbers show how many survivors have been affected by GBV, but we can know how many people accessed a service, right? And again, we have to know what kind of service was actually accessed by the survivors. So if you assume prevalence with the number of people that has reached a service, there are risk of undermining and misunderstand how big the problem is, and therefore lead to pushing donors, for example, to deprioritize or give less attention to one sector. And there are so many reasons why numbers can be low at a service provision place, right? Especially within the humanitarian response. And this also brings us to narrowing the understanding. We don't have a full picture, and that would be definitely not a good practice to just put absolute figures. It's not sufficient to understand what we're talking about. It has to be accompanied with an analysis. We can go very deep in the interpretation into, for example, what kind of violence we want to know that. If you're just pushing numbers, well, people can assume that we're only talking about sexual violence, for example, although there are other realities for women and girls seeking services for the reasons. So we want to understand deeper, have a finer understanding of incident data as well. In the long term, sharing case numbers, well, it does create a sort of dependency. We would rely on numbers to actually act, to have intervention, whereas this is not necessary to have those numbers at the end of the day to have to fight against GBV. Regardless of the concrete evidence, regardless of the numbers, there is a need to act, and there are other ways to get information and analysis of on GBV. So what could be a good practice? Well, the title, I know the title of the invitation was what to do, what not to do. I don't know if there are good practices or not good practices. It's not a question of giving lessons or not, but I'll show you what can be done with incident data, with numbers, without numbers, with percentage. I'm going to give you an example. It's a bit dated, 2 years back now. We're talking 2022, 2021, actually, for some of the data from the Central African Republic. I wanted to share some data from incident and through the GBV IMS in Somalia, the most recent one from the year 2023. And I must say Somalia is very interesting because they don't share numbers. They don't share geographic levels. You get trends, you get very good analysis of how the evolution of GBV, of services, of the types of GBV happening in the main states, right? 3 main states. But they don't share geographic level. They don't share information that could lead to harming service providers or survivors. So it's a very good practice actually to have a look at, and some of the data is shared again as percentage. Some other context, and using older information, I'd like to show you how it can be done in Central African Republic, for example. So GBV service mapping, we've done that work a few years back now. So working with, for example, 4W, using that type of template so 4W is a monitoring data system on response. So we want to monitor response with regards to a humanitarian response plan, and it's a common tool that is used to know where are the actors and where they where they have intervention, what they are doing, and how many people they've reached, for example. So these are the questions that are captured through this tool that is 4W, who is doing what where. And many of you probably know. But we use that also to capture information about services. Where are the services? GBV services in a country. So we've done that over a course of a year, and at the end we've captured a map of so many different service providers in Central African Republic. So what you see on this map is the number of service provision centers, all type of services in the country, right? So where it's darker, you have more services, up to 35. When it's lighter, you have lighter gray, you have only 1 or 2. and where it's white, there is no data. Then from there, let me show you that differently. So we have psychosocial support, for example. You can see the bigger the circle, the bigger the number of service provision points for psychosocial. Medical support, again, you see that it's towards the west of the country. Now we go for other type of services, and you see the figures and numbers and circles getting small. So you can assess, and I already have an understanding, well, oh, maybe safe spaces, this is the case for this one, should be prioritized in this particular context. We just from here. Sorry about that. Give me just a sec. I want to show you a map that will allow us to there you go. Right. So this is, as you can see, a map of Central African Republic. We have, as I showed you earlier, the psychosocial support number of service provision point in the country. Okay. Then we have, well, all service provision. So you see it gets darker. It gets darker towards the west and lighter, so less service provision points in other areas. Now, so legal, less again. Now, these are the number of, I'm not putting right the number, I'm showing you how dark it is. These are the areas where you've had the bigger number of reported cases, all types of GBV included here in the country. Okay, from lighter, even if it's a light gray, there has been a certain number of them. What does it show on the legend? So from 1 to 250 cases, we're talking for the whole year 2021 to more than almost 1,424 would be the maximum in the darker areas. Okay, that is distributed. Now, when we look at that and we compare this to violent incidents, occurrence of violent incidents in this case. So violent incidents is the number of fatalities in the year 2011 compared to occurrence of GBV. Well, you can see that, well, in some areas, we don't have data of GBV reported, but high number of violent incidents. We're using what could be called a proxy indicator. Don't like the word proxy indicator, but it is what it is. So we're using another information to know if there could be a higher risks of GBV. So if you're looking here, it seems that, yes, there has been more violent incidents in this area, and therefore we could have more GBV incidents being reported. However, over here, you have higher number of incidents, but lower number of reported cases. Why is that? If we look at medical, we see that there are quite a few services in those areas, meaning that, well, maybe we should prioritize. Having no information in this case may show that we are in phases where in places where there should be priority where there are gaps actually in service provision and what kind of service provision we should be prioritizing in those areas. Now this. Sorry, let me just remove this and put all, psychosocial and IPC. IPC is, some of you don't know, the IPC is the integrated phase classification of food insecurity, and these were the projection for 2022. Service provision here is from 20. So in the areas where we have high possibility of food insecurity, high levels of food insecurity, you should have more. We can infer, and we've seen that in Somalia, for example, in the areas that were mostly affected by the last drought and high food insecurity and famine in the country last year. We've seen that there's been increases of up to 20% in the number of reported cases. Here, the links should be also seen. So the number of service provision could be prioritized, more services maybe in certain areas. Now, not having numbers could also show that there are no service provision, but if there are no service provision, if there are service provision, but maybe there is no access. So these are different elements that could definitely influence the way we are looking at data. All right, so let me just go back to my presentation and oh, wait a sec, sorry. Where's my Zoom? So yes, what I was showing to you is the number of reported cases compared to the higher food insecurity areas. So you can see that there aren't any where there should be. You have higher risk of GBV. So the reported cases here are not reflected in areas where you have high level of food insecurity. Similarly, where you have high conflicts, we don't see any reported cases at all, the white areas for the maps on the map on the right. So these type of analysis can help in terms of understanding this one, right? And then we can go into the details of that, but with more granular and refined information. So you have more reference here, and you can go and have a look at all that. So on the minimum standards, quality of services, for example, there's some resource on the GBV help desk. You have podcasts, you have quite a few information on the SURF, for example, or guidance existing on GBV reporting. So here you go. I would be very happy to hear from you. I hope we have some questions, and if I can answer them, thank you.
Thank you, Adesh. That was a really great start to this complex conversation around the use of incident data. We didn't have so many questions in the chat, but I will start with this one. We had one of our participants who is asking, of course, the reported GBV incidents do not show prevalence of GBV in specific areas. What do you advise us to do in terms of resource allocation, such as budget estimations for intervention that directly goes for GBV survivors? For instance, cash for GBV GBV case management, facilitating referrals. So I think this is basically what do you recommend in place of using those sort of incident numbers? And it probably goes back to those standards of GBV programming that we were just discussing. But I'll turn that over to you, Adish.
I think assessing, I don't know if vulnerability is the right word, but severity is. So when we're doing humanitarian response plan, HRP, or HNRP as it's becoming the practice now. So humanitarian needs, overview, and response plan. We want to assess the vulnerability of an area, and specifically with regards to GBV, we want to know how severe or how high the risks are for women and girls with regards to GBV, right? In particular areas. And there are different ways to assess this severity. The number has an indicator that we use to assess severity in HNO is the number of services within a specific admin level that we are using for the HNO. So if there are services, how many of them and how diverse those services are allows us to have an understanding on how severe it could be if there are other risks that would be associated with violent events, displacement of population, depending on how what kind of context we're talking, if it's a conflict, if it's national disaster, for example. But we're not talking about prevalence here. We're talking about the risk of GBV occurring in more vulnerable region compared to others. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't prioritize other areas, but you are looking at ways that are where there is more vulnerability. Less services can lead to higher vulnerability or more risk or more severity. I hope that helps in terms of answering the question.
It does, Adish. Thank you. And I just want to mention that we did put a link in the chat to our 16 minimum standards for GBV and emergencies programming. And this is a great resource that really reinforces what Adish was just saying, that it's really about focusing on the quality of care that we are providing, because once we know if the quality or standard service is there, then women and girls and men and boys will feel more confident and comfortable accessing that service. So really, we have to get it right at the foundation. And since much of our incident data is monitored at service points, it's really important, as Adish was saying, that we get it right at the service point so that we are, in fact, measuring the success of our programs based on the quality of the service we can provide and not jumping ahead and looking at the service. I hope that makes sense to everyone as well. Let's see. And maybe Adish, you had mentioned this. We have a question about, and maybe I can easily do this one. So Everjoy, who is our member organization from CARE International. If you are interested in the presentation that Adish just gave, you can find this webinar and all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. And Everjoy, I think if you have specific data, please write it, and then I'll see if we can find it and link it. And then we have another question from our colleagues in Somalia. So the question is, Adish, does the failure to meet the donor set target in a protection programming incorporating case management and awareness raising imply underreporting of cases, or is it indicative of successful awareness efforts leading to a reduction in GBV incidents? And can this be used to measure program success? That's a big one.
That's a tricky question. I was going to say. Well, I don't.
Yeah,
The indicator is important. I think from, as Jessica mentioned, I think what we need to get right, and probably discussing with the program designer when you are creating the program and how you're going to monitor this program with the donors as well, depending on what kind of target. It is important to get the indicator right as well. What can be achieved, right? Um, you don't want to measure the success of a service provision center with how many people access, because access and reach uh, the center, because at the same time, yes, you want people to come and access, but what were the service provided at that moment? Was it medical? Was it psychosocial, or was it just awareness? Was it just was it a center that is because it's a safe space, women and girls do come? There are different reasons why in the reality, in the context that we are looking at, why the people or women and girls have accessed this service. So this could be an indicator, the reasons why they were accessed. Also, not having high numbers doesn't mean that it's a lack. It can be a lack of access or accessibility, difficult to reach. It doesn't mean that the sensitization campaign didn't work. The information campaign didn't work. It was, and that because you've been able to reach so many people outside of the center, and that they don't need to come anymore. There's no relation between the two, I think. So setting the indicator is very important to measure the monitoring, to monitor a program, I think. It's difficult to say if a successful awareness program led to reduction of GBV incidents. That there needs to be a study on that, probably, just to assess this particular question. But on top of my head, just with an indicator, that is probably not possible. If Jessica, you want to add something?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one, too, that I'm going to start just from the beginning there, when it says failure to meet the donor set target. And I guess that's something we as a community should also be advocating for, is that donors, and I think we've done this to a point, is that donors are also kind of changing their narrative so that they also recognize that incident data is not looking at program quality. And so that's where we would, right from the beginning of your question, we would want to change this narrative to really focus on the quality of the program being delivered rather than the number of people who come through the door. And so I really encourage all of you to go to that link for the 16 minimum standards for GBV and emergency programming. They incorporate indicators that look at just this. And so we also have an M&E toolkit, because we really strongly believe this as a GBV AOR or a community, that we switch or shift some of the ways that we do our work. So please note, and I put it in the chat, and you can also find it on the GBV AOR GBV AOR website under tools and resources. You'll find our 16 minimum standards guidelines. And then perhaps more importantly for our colleagues, Ali, you'll also see the M&E toolkit, which incorporates a lot of different indicators that are not specific to incident data. And so it will help you, I think, exactly do that. How do we make sure, how do we measure, for instance, women and girls engagement at community level? So look out for that. I put a link in there, maybe someone else can as well. But really great questions. We have 2 more questions, and then I think we're going to have to come to the end of our time. So how about we look at Angeline, and this one's also maybe a bit, I like Angeline because now she's also switching the focus over to program. And so Angeline is saying more information about how GBV programming in humanitarian settings is different from GBV in development. And then also if you could share more in terms of what not to do in development versus humanitarian if they are different. This is also a bit of a challenge for us maybe because Angeline, we work almost exclusively in humanitarian settings. So you'll notice that much of our guidance is centered around humanitarian interventions. But that said, I think our level or standards of both information and data collection and dissemination are really global standards that should be used and really promoted in both humanitarian settings and also in development settings. It's all about the safety, security, and ethical standards of data collection. But maybe Adish, if you have anything additionally to add to that.
I think no, that is exactly right. We we can the standards and the way data is collected when we working in humanitarian, I think, can be translated to a development context, especially if it will be adapted, but especially if there is a lot of work that needs to be done in those development contexts. So you have a open canvas, if I can say this way, right? You can actually do the right, put the right standards in place as soon as you begin from the onset.
Yeah, really good. And then I think we'll do our last question Adish from Onyango. He's saying, but the number of cases is indicative of prevalence, even though we should not conclude that there is no prevalence where there are no reported cases. Is that right? And I think this goes to that concept of underreporting, what you were mentioning, that it doesn't necessarily give us the whole picture.
You
So
don't
again,
need any
yeah.
report. You don't need any case numbers to actually intervene or have GBV intervention or have GBV services being placed. The lack of information doesn't mean that there is no prevalence exactly. I mean, there should be some reason why there is no reported cases. It's not what we're looking for. We're looking at how we want to have the services in place to act in when you have GBV cases being reported, I think.
Yes. And also noting that a lot of times we look at some of our development data in order to sort of give us an idea of the level of incidences or just the prevalence in emergencies as well. And there's lots of studies, DSM and others that we can look to just even during a simple desk review. That doesn't require incident data. So please also note that. I think those were our last questions and we are running on the hour. I just want to thank Adish so much for the presentation today. And we had a lot of questions as well, because we do have a lot of French speaking colleagues on the line. And we're really fortunate that Adish is also a native French speaker. So I have, Adish, I've kind of put you out there that we will be having another webinar on this topic that will be presented in French. And so please look for that. We will have that in the next week or two. It's basically this presentation, but in French for those colleagues in our French speaking countries. And we will be coordinating with my counterpart in West Africa. So make sure to look out for those invitations. Also, just very quickly, for those who attended our previous learning or emerging practice events on self-care, I did want to mention that today is the last day to sign up for our 6-week sort of self-reflection on self-care. So if you are a frontline GBV service provider working for a local organization, and he wanted to learn about more techniques and coping strategies for stress in emergencies, we did send out the application process, as we noted last month, for that 6-week series that we are facilitating here through the GBV, Regional GBV Working Group for East and Southern Africa. If you have not seen the application, please do reach out to the coordinators of your subclusters or working groups at country level. And we do hope that our frontline service providers working for local and civil society organizations will take that opportunity to sign up for that self-care capacity building so that we can help minimize burnout, but then also understanding the stress of being frontline service providers and the impact it has on our own lives. So thank you again to Adish. We really appreciate all the work that you're doing on behalf of the Regional GBV Working Group here in East and Southern Africa. If you would like to join, if you're an organization that has a regional presence and would like to join our working group, please do reach out to Kabeli. Thanks, Kabeli, for being here. And that's at kabeli@unfpa.org. And she can add you to our mailing list. But as always, we're really happy to see all of you on the line, and we look forward to seeing you next month. I know we had a lot of learning events this month, so we appreciate all of your participation, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our emerging practice and other learning events. So thanks everybody for joining, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks everybody.